Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out this evening. I'm Bill Brown of Brookings Mountain West. On behalf of my colleagues, Executive Director David Demore, Caitlin Saladino, Ashley LeClaire, and our many students, thanks for visiting with us as we discuss another important public policy topic to this region, which has many different aspects, and I think we're going to touch on a couple you might not expect tonight. As you can see, our colleagues in Greenspun Hall are recording the event, so if you have any friends or colleagues who would benefit from what we're going to see and hear tonight, you'll be able to refer them to our website and our YouTube channel, where this will all be up and available very soon, in probably 48 to 72 hours, as will the PowerPoint that you'll see tonight. So do not hurt yourself trying to transcribe any data. It'll be easily available. Just a couple words about our colleague Joe Kane, who's out from the Brookings Institution this week. Like all our visiting scholars, he's been engaging with students in a number of classes, with UNLV faculty who share his research interests, and also, most importantly, perhaps with stakeholders in the region who are trying to deal with our water issues and challenges. Joe is a fellow at the Brookings Metro program, and his work covers an array of built environment issues, including transportation and water infrastructure, and then the intersection of economic development with those issues, which is another aspect of this water topic that's important to us. Prior to Brookings, Joe was an economist at the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. You may have seen that organization in the news recently. I'll let Joe decide if he wants to address that. Joe holds a master's degree in urban and environmental planning from the University of Virginia and a bachelor's degree in economics and history from the College of William and Mary. But I should stress he's no stranger to the West and our water issues. So I'll turn it over to Joe.
Great, thanks, Bill. Thanks for being here, everyone. We'll tune in later. So as Bill was saying, my name's Joe Kane. I'm a fellow at the Brookings Institution based in Washington. And a lot of my work focuses on all things infrastructure. And tonight I'll be talking a lot about water issues, kind of defining exactly what we mean by that, what it means across the country, what it means for Las Vegas, and not just purely in kind of an engineering sense, but in particular what it means for the regional economy and beyond. I do also cover a lot of issues related to transportation, energy, broadband, climate too, and so I think you'll probably see some parallels and other issues to consider when we go through tonight's presentation. So I think just to start, again, when we're kind of thinking of like the water sector overall, a lot of people just think of what's visible in front of them. We think of just turning on the tap. It's an essential resource, I think, that many of us probably take for granted. And that's our reality every day of just, we think, well, this is just gonna be here. This is something that just kind of almost naturally happens, but that couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, a lot of our water infrastructure, right, is out of sight and out of mind. It includes our pipes, it includes many of our distribution systems, it includes a whole host of different assets and facilities that we don't really recognize until there is a problem, quite honestly, until there is a water main burst, a leak, whatever the case may be. And so many people, we either take water for granted or when there is a problem, we say, well, what's causing this? You know, why were we not staying ahead of these issues? And so, you know, many of the major assets also in terms of our treatment facilities are kind of at the corner of our regions. They may smell bad. You know, we tend to not think of these as well, yet they're so vitally important to delivering this essential resource to a variety of users, not just households, but also businesses, industries, and so on. Here in closer to Vegas, you know, we think of some of our natural water infrastructure systems, Lake Mead, Colorado River, so essential to water supply, essential for our climate, essential for so many different reasons. And so it's not just our physical gray infrastructure systems, but it is also our rivers, our lakes, our streams, our coastal resources, and as you can imagine, these are pretty extensive all across the country. I'd be remiss not to mention, you know, beyond sort of the supply of water, there's a lot of wastewater, there's a lot of stormwater. What happens to water when we use it? Where does it go? How do cities, how do states, how does the country overall handle these issues? And this is, as I'll talk about, is increasingly becoming a major concern in terms of cost and environmental impact. You may see also, actually, if you're driving or you're in a parking lot, you may see a rain garden. You may see at an individual property level, you might see a rain barrel or rain cistern. You may see other sort of riparian buffers. Many of our green infrastructure systems have a huge role to play in our water infrastructure too, not only from an environmental quality standpoint, but also a livability standpoint. Many of these systems can provide shade, they can provide relief from the heat, they can serve as locations for recreation. So I'll be talking more about these systems as well. But I think if we were to put all of this together, right, it's not so much a sector in as much as a super sector in a lot of ways. And so when we think of water as a resource and as really a foundation for our environment, our health, and our economy, it spans our drinking water systems, it spans our wastewater systems, our stormwater systems, and then our green infrastructure assets too. So a wide variety of infrastructure projects and facilities all over the country. And I think it goes almost kind of without saying just how important all of this is, not just at an individual level, but for literally our economy every day. When we think of agriculture, for example, irrigation, huge water user across the country, particularly in states like Arizona and California, not too far off here from where we are right now. Power industry, thermoelectric power is another huge water user. Areas I think for innovation in both of these sectors, but still a lot of room to improve too in terms of using these resources better. On the right, as you can see, something that's been in the news a lot lately: data centers, AI. Huge energy needs for these facilities, but also water needs, and I think huge questions of exactly how are tech companies going to be using this resource more sustainably, more cost effectively, and I would argue many of them, including regions, are adapting in real time. They don't have all the clearest answers around these issues. In Vegas and many other markets too, I mean, water is essential for growth, right? You think for new housing, new population growth. Without water, I mean, that would be literally impossible, but that puts huge strain and stress on many of these existing systems and leads to huge questions about where the water is going to come from over time, if not in the next few years, over the next few decades. And it creates both a challenge and an opportunity, I think, in terms of thinking of our water infrastructure writ large, in terms of how much we invest, where we invest, and then ultimately what are the returns on that investment. So laying all that out, I mean, there's a huge scale and variety of systems across the country, right? It's something that a lot of people don't really think about in terms of our water infrastructure, but because there's such a huge scale and variety of systems and facilities, not surprisingly, there's a lot of challenges as well. And I'll unpack these in a little more detail over the next few slides, but a few statistics just to kick things off. But a lot of our water infrastructure is aging. As engineers like to say, it's the end of its useful life. This is just one pretty startling statistic, in my opinion. Over 2 trillion gallons of water is lost to leaking, aging pipes across the country each year. You imagine this is especially an issue in some older industrial cities, parts of the Great Lakes region, the Northeast, but certainly not exclusive to those markets. And so, even the water that's being treated is getting lost. And that leads to, as utilities will say, non-revenue water. So, huge challenge in keeping up with the repairs of our systems that are already in place. And the age of some pipes, 50 to 100 years in some cases. In fact, they're digging up pipes to repair that go back to even the Civil War era, the 19th century. So pretty startling when we think of just the age of all these assets. The elephant in the room often in these conversations, as we'll go into, is the cost of all of this. How are we going to pay for all of this? and this is from EPA water needs assessments that come out every few years, but $744 billion in water and wastewater investment is going to be needed over the next 20 years. Just a staggering total, and shows that even just to keep our systems in a state of good repair is going to take a lot of investment. And as we'll talk about, that isn't just true at a national level, it's especially true and hitting the shoulders of states and local leaders in this case. The sheer expanse of all the systems across the country, as I'll sort of talk about in terms of utilities, the local systems, the publicly owned and operated systems. Also, there are privately owned and operated systems too, but for the most part, we are a country that depends on publicly owned and operated water infrastructure. Over 50,000 water systems across the country. And so that leads to hyper-fragmentation, hyper-localization of many of these issues and real struggles to coordinate action and planning, at least at any sort of scale. And so we'll talk more about that. And last but not least, and this is just one statistic just to highlight on sort of the rapid rise in flood claims, for example, but climate and sort of the impacts of climate in both sort of sudden and acute ways, but also in chronic and continual ways, is leading to sort of a moving target for many of these systems. So in as much as we're struggling to keep up with our existing needs, those needs are only getting more serious because of the uncertainties of climate and other environmental pressures across the country. So huge, expansive challenges, and I love this map showing at least all the major rivers and watersheds across the country, but extensive variety across different regions. I mean, if you're focusing on the Mountain West and the West Coast, it's often a story focused on water scarcity, right, issues and water supply. In the Gulf Coast, right, it's less that conversation. It's more too much water, flood risk, perhaps pollution and other sort of water quality concerns. We see that certainly in the Great Lakes and the Upper Midwest, lead pipe, issues, remediation issues. We see that in parts of the Northeast as well. Runoff concerns, as I was describing before, are pretty widespread too. But I'll say that there's a sharing of responsibilities, and this is something that I'll bring up more later on. But given the national reach of these challenges and the localization of these challenges, it is going to require a shared of responsibilities between the federal government, state governments, and local governments. And at the federal level, I don't think I have a dedicated slide on this, but at the federal level, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of the Interior, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, that's even fractured at a federal level on some of these issues in terms of regulatory oversight and then some financial input as well. The Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act are our two major pieces of regulation ensuring that we have safe, reliable water across the country, and those really are foundational to how many of our federal and national partners view these issues. But as we'll talk about, states and localities, and in particular the local utilities, face many different challenges that I would say are more severe in some cases than what we see even at a federal or national level. This graph shows just the sort of the fragmentation and the fragmented governance, which I like to highlight even before getting into the money. A lot of policymakers, especially in Washington, look at our water infrastructure in terms of the money that's needed. But the reason we need the money, besides the aging infrastructure, besides all these challenges I'm highlighting, is often the lack of capacity among individual systems. And you can see on the left-hand side of this chart, the vast majority of our public drinking water systems, more than half, in number, are serving only 500 people or fewer, right? So vast majority of those 50,000 systems I was pointing out before are in rural and smaller communities in many cases. There can be smaller systems in urban areas too, but again, just the sheer number of small systems across the country is quite noticeable. You can see on the far right of this chart, we do have some very large water systems too, that you see in markets that serve more than 100,000 people. So we have just a huge expanse, right, on the one hand of having to think about some very small systems and rural communities, and then also some very large urban systems that have some similar challenges, but also very different challenges in different cases. I really like this map, and obviously being from DC, I think about these issues there quite frequently. But that shows that when we think of our service areas and the boundaries of these systems, it's not like they line up very nicely with our city or jurisdictional boundaries or our county boundaries. More often than not, they match our watershed boundaries. And water being so interconnected, it doesn't really care, if it's leaving Las Vegas and it's going to the neighboring, right, community. It's all connected, and our water systems, including the location of our treatment plants and even our pipes, often traverse multiple geographies, multiple jurisdictions, even state lines, as you can see in this case. And that only further increases the complexity, as you can imagine, in planning and investment to actually stay ahead of all these needs. I'll come back to this later, but there's often, I'll say increasingly, a focus on regional scale to all these issues. So in as much as you can look at this on a system-by-system basis and in each locality, increasingly a lot of researchers and policymakers are thinking of these issues at a regional scale. So perhaps how can we think of, and I know here in Las Vegas, with the Southern Nevada Water Authority being really a great case of this, how do we think of member agencies perhaps being part of a larger cohesive unit? And I think there's a lot to unpack and a lot to think about in the benefits of such an approach. Investment challenges. I think I want to say like next dozen slides are just on investment challenges here. But as I pointed out before, many of our systems are aging and or just outmoded for the current moment in which we're in. Given population growth, given new industrial demands, data centers, AI, et cetera. Even though we are becoming, this is sort of general, but like across the country, much more efficient on a per capita basis in our water use, and we are incorporating new technologies, the fact is that much of our existing systems are still old and in many cases unable to keep up with these new pressures, including that of our economy, of individual households and other users. Water quality concerns certainly are another area that is becoming and has always been a concern. Certainly, you can see on the right here, made national news about a decade ago, Flint, Michigan, being in many cases an exceptional case given some of the economic challenges of that community. But for those who are not familiar, faced a huge lead pipe and lead remediation challenge. Closely tied to the inability in that case of that system to stay ahead of their investment needs. PFAS, I don't know how many of you have heard of that, but also chemicals that we're finding in our water supply that are receiving additional scrutiny from regulators and are finding to be having tremendous health concerns too. To stay up with and to keep up with new regulations that are emerging on these contaminants, that's putting even more financial strain on water systems to actually come up with the money to keep up with that. Stormwater issues as well, sedimentation and other runoff is increasingly a huge challenge and a huge budget line item for communities. And it's not simply an option. It's very much a requirement. For those who are not familiar, many older communities rely on combined sewer systems. And in other words, wastewater is combined with stormwater. So you'll see during a major rain event, for example, that there can be what are known as combined sewer overflows, that stormwater and wastewater may be discharged into the environment, leading to huge environmental impacts and quality concerns. That means that communities are having to quite literally replace their whole sewer systems, which is very costly. They need to separate their sewer systems. So in other words, they need to have dedicated lines for wastewater versus stormwater. And so for many mayors who may not be familiar with water infrastructure, they become very quickly familiar as a result of this being a huge budget line item for them to keep up with. I alluded to this a little bit before. Climate impacts. I think we read about this quite a bit in the news. On the one hand, as you can see on the image on the left here, in some communities, just too much water, right? And it's not even just flood events. I think this is in New York City, I want to say, that it even flooded the subway. But it's not even during just sort of a major hurricane or storm. Increasingly, it's becoming just during regular rain events. We see chronic challenges, particularly among some coastal cities, with storm surges, with inability for people even to get to work, leading to continual disruptions, not just widespread destruction, but just continual disruptions that can lead to significant costs. On the right, which might be a little more familiar here in Las Vegas, drought concerns, right? Heat, stress, the reality that many places are facing less frequent rainfall, and then that leads to, of course, the challenge of, well, how do you kind of capture that? How do you take advantage of the water resources you may already have in hand, but then the reality is it's only getting harder to do so. And so, these are just two examples. I could provide many others, but the reality that climate is hitting communities and is leading to certainly greater financial risk, if not just direct financial impact for these systems. So I put out kind of all the investment needs, and sort of related to the governance needs, and I think this kind of puts them together, where this is based on a survey that the American Water Works Association puts together every few years. But I think if you talk to most people across the country and you're like, hey, should we invest in our water infrastructure? I don't think you'll hear much debate. Like, yeah, I think that's pretty important. Like, I think we should do that. And you can see here, 88% of Americans believe some type of action is needed to stay ahead of these water challenges. But then you look at the reverse of this and you ask, utilities, you're like, well, are you confident that you can actually deliver on these goals? And only 17% say they are confident that they can cover the costs of just what they have to do right now, let alone take on all these other upgrades I'm talking about. So it's this mismatch, right? This mismatch, and we see kind of in investment demand and institutional capacity. And so it's not that there isn't the will to do more on these issues. It is really about capacity of individual small systems, and even larger systems in some cases, even come up with the money, the plans, the technologies, the other improvements that are going to be needed to actually bring us into not just a state of good repair, but hopefully into an age that we can better predict the needs over time. This is a figure quickly. Won't go through all of it, but if you focus on the teal bar in the middle, this shows effectively the funding gap that we have. Even this is as of 2024, so I'll just say currently there's $110 billion funding gap on an annual basis here when we consider the various sort of funding that's available for these improvements, whether it comes from federal funding. Municipal bonds are a huge area in which communities are borrowing. They often have to take on debt to pay for these improvements. That's true in transportation and other parts of infrastructure. User fees are a primary revenue source, so the rates that everyone pays with their water bills every month. But given these existing revenue streams, they cannot keep up with the operating expenditures, as you can see, even the PFAS regulations, building greater infrastructure resilience. And in fact, this gap is only projected to grow even more significant. I mean, almost double by 2030 across the country. So, pretty alarming, in my opinion, that a lot of the tools that we have available to us right now in terms of policy and investment are seemingly unable to keep up with the pace of demand that we're seeing across the country. This chart, I mean, I could also show this for our transportation infrastructure as well, but for water, it's even more severe. But a lot of people are like, well, what can't the federal government do more on these issues? Aren't they already doing more? We'll talk more about the bipartisan infrastructure law in a second, but you'll see that over time there has been just a steady pullback in federal spending on our water infrastructure. In many cases, states and localities are primary owners or operators and investors in infrastructure. They're responsible for over 90% of public spending on an annual basis now. You'll see a spike in the 1970s to early 1980s when the federal government did spend more on water infrastructure, and that was, as you can imagine, following the passage of the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, many of the environmental pushes we saw across the country. And really since then, even you can see in 2010 when we had the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in the Obama administration, where there was a little bit of an uptick in spending on water, you can see it didn't really change the fundamental calculus of this. If anything, states and localities are continuing to have to bear more weight and more financial pressure to stay ahead of these needs. And if anything else, if people have been following the news lately, it seems like the pace of this might only be getting faster, right? Where the needs keep seemingly going up in terms of our water infrastructure, but then also the signaling we're hearing from the new administration, from Congress, is that, hey, we're going to halt funding and we are not going to provide the certainty that so many communities quite literally depend on to take care of these issues. So it creates a lot of uncertainty and additional pressure for states and local leaders to actually address these issues. Just to really quickly point out, if we're to look at the federal funding specifically in the 1970s and kind of what it now looks like as we entered sort of the 2000s and 2010s, what's important to note is a lot of those came in the form of grants. There was a construction grants program that the federal government, in other words, provided grants to communities to help build out this infrastructure, which obviously lessened the pressure at that time. Starting in the 1980s, those grant programs were eventually transformed into loan programs. So the federal government, even when it does provide financial support for our water infrastructure, typically comes in the form of loans, loan guarantees. I'll be talking about in a second here the state revolving fund program. Sounds kind of technical, but refers to basically state-led loan programs that are supported by federal funding, but they're still loans, right? And you talk to kind of that survey result I showed you before, where 17% of utilities are not confident they can generate the revenue to stay ahead of their current needs. And meanwhile, when they're looking up to the federal government and even their state peers, it often comes in the form of loans, right? And so even low-cost loans doesn't really change the math in their favor in all cases. So just really important to bear in mind that this is not just grants that are coming from the federal government. In fact, it's loans, and it's a shift to more loans and more lending where little support currently exists. What that means then in terms of the user fees or the water bills that utilities are charging, we're seeing a rise in rates across the country. This is a bit of a generalization. These are not specific. I think the one on the right is for the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. You'll find a wide variety of rate setting and structures across the country, so I'm not really capturing all of that here on this one slide. We see volumetric rates, so typically depending on how much water people use, different users, including agriculture, industry, not just households, use. But we are seeing, there's also fixed fees too, or connection charges we see across the country as well. But in general, you'll see an increase in rates. And so that is kind of, I would say, a necessity on the part of the water systems, where they're kind of trying to strike this balance between investment and conservation and then affordability, right? And it creates this tension where, if you are even conserving more water, how are you getting the revenue you need from users to keep up with this investment demand? It's a real challenge. And I will say, we see this in areas like Detroit, Buffalo. I think I have a slide later on Buffalo. Many communities, and we saw this glaringly obvious during the pandemic, where water was just even more essential than ever, perhaps. And households, particularly lower income households, are increasingly struggling to keep up with these needs, right? And so they are having to resort to bottled water, other assistance, and obviously that is not a sustainable solution over time either. So it's just to say that there are quite a few equity implications of all of this. It's not just simply an operational and investment sort of concern. It very much hits individual people and households too. Something that I focus on quite a bit, and people don't often think about with water infrastructure, or really all of infrastructure, are the people and the workers responsible for many of these improvements. So we talk about sort of the governance needed to sort of stay ahead of all of this, the investment that's needed, and all the sort of various funding and financing pressures, but the staffing capacity, quite literally, who is going to be doing all of this? And this is what's keeping a lot of water utilities up at night, is they are facing an exodus, if not, I'd say sort of a silver tsunami of workforce talent in this space. I'll say about it, I think it's maybe in the next, I think it's in a following slide, but the aging workforce here is a big concern. And I'll say in terms of reaching younger and different types of workers is a concern, and water utilities are struggling really to handle both at the moment. But that doesn't mean that there isn't an opportunity here. And so some research I've done that helped inform new water workforce efforts at EPA and among other large water associations across the country shows that there are actually over 1.7 million workers in the water sector total across 212 different occupations. So variety of career pathways here that span, as you can imagine, across a variety of regions and industries. I don't think I have a separate slide on this, but these are not just construction jobs, right? I mean, these are operation and maintenance positions. These are water treatment operators. These are electricians. These are other technical roles, a lot of STEM-focused roles. The potential of these positions, though, so as much as there's a challenge to fill these roles, there's a huge economic potential of filling them because many of these roles can pay more competitive wages. There are big shoes to fill and a lot of shoes to fill in coming years. And in fact, they do promote work-based learning opportunities. So in a time where many younger people may be looking towards careers that might be AI resistant, I mean, these are quite literally those types of careers. And we tend to see this in other sectors of infrastructure and the building trades more broadly. Just to say, and as much as this is a challenge, it is also very much an opportunity too. Yeah, and so here's some of the demographics that I was alluding to briefly before. At the median, water treatment operators being about 46 years of age versus 42 years for all workers nationally. So on the other, one side, we have a pipeline that's kind of full at the end here of the sort of the water career, but on the other hand, we also have a pipeline that's kind of empty at the beginning, and that leads to some very significant recruitment and training challenges. It leads to retention challenges. It leads to real challenges in succession planning and knowledge transfer. What happens when you have someone who is familiar with these systems for 20, 30 years, during that 1970s period in particular, when there was funding and movement towards these fields, a lot of people joined this workforce. A lot of those people are now aging and retiring or eligible for retirement. So we are at very much an inflection point here to reach different workers. And then, I mean, this is just, I think, perhaps one of the more startling statistics, but if you were to line up, 100 workers in a room in the water workforce, only 15% of those workers are women, right? Compared to 47% across the whole labor market. So clearly there needs to be a better job done here, in my opinion, in not just simply on the part of water utilities to do community outreach, to reach different people, to provide flexible and accessible training pathways. But they probably need to also work closely together with our workforce development partners, including educational institutions, other training providers, community-based organizations. There's a lot of research on this, including the need for supportive services, childcare, transportation to a work or training site. This is all highly relevant in this space right now. And given the lack of capacity among many of these systems, right, they don't have necessarily the resources to support such efforts, yet they need these workers because they are so mission critical. So just to highlight, this is not just an infrastructure challenge, it is very much an economic challenge, but it also, I think, lends itself to a larger economic opportunity as well. So I promise I'm not going to be all pessimistic and negative here. I'm going to try to end on a high note. So, given the expanse of different systems we have in front of us and just all the assortments of challenges we see facing them, there are positive things happening here. And I think there are some emerging and potential solutions we're seeing across the country. As I said kind of at the top, there is going to be no silver bullet solution for this. It's not like, hey, water utilities, you got to do it all yourself. Hey, federal government, you're going to come in and just rain more resources down on everyone. That's probably not happening. Hey, state leaders, maybe you're an important intermediary in some of these regulatory and funding conversations. That's true, but it's going to require a shared, I would say, responsibility and burden on the part of federal, state, and local leaders here. And you can just see a few examples under each of these categories. And at the federal side, often I think forging the stronger, this kind of sounds Pollyannish, but forging stronger collaborations with states and local utilities. EPA shouldn't just be a separate entity just kind of overseeing regulatory oversight, but like it needs to actually better understand and measure and have I would argue a consistent national strategy around our water infrastructure, which is basically lacking at the moment. We've heard a lot about this in the last few years around technical assistance, or TA. So as federal funding, including even those loans, go out the door, are communities even able to access those? I mean, I think federal leaders certainly have a responsibility in ensuring that all types of communities have an ability to understand what opportunities are available to them, including not just existing resources, but potential resources that could come down. At a state level, as I'll talk about in a couple more slides, they are also important policy setters with those state revolving funds I had mentioned earlier. There's sometimes a lack of clarity on the timeline of that funding, the targets, the intended goals and criteria behind prioritizing certain projects at a state level. Capacity needs, I keep mentioning capacity, but I'll keep repeating it because it's so important. Centering capacity needs as part of that state revolving fund process is going to be really important to consider too, which I'll talk about in a couple slides. And at a local level, in as much as there are pretty stiff headwinds here facing them, there does need to be, I think, a continued appetite and interest in experimentation, that the status quo is probably not good enough. And so there are going to have to be, I think, more, I won't say like leaps of faith, but a greater interest and an ability to test, particularly on the funding and financing side, to pay for all these improvements. Simply taking on more debt and raising water rates is probably not going to cut it in years to come. And how they're going to do that, as I'll kind of get into more, is in terms of collaborative cross-sectoral approaches with other regional partners. There needs to be a greater scale, I think, to some of these local efforts. This is a quick screenshot of a tool that I recommend if you haven't seen, that Brookings Metro put together, called the Federal Infrastructure Hub. So if you've heard of kind of the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, obviously huge questions at the moment federally on kind of the future direction of not only funding from these two pieces of legislation, but what comes after. But we actually unpacked all of this and put it into a very nice visual format, so you do not have to read a 900-page PDF like we did. So you can easily sort and filter, as you can see here, either by transportation-related programs or energy-related programs or broadband. But if you pay attention to sort of that little teal, I think I got a laser pointer here, yeah. This little teal box on water, you'll see still pretty huge, $58 billion. And so this has been spread most crucially over 5 years. So in the case of the bipartisan infrastructure law, was passed in 2021. It will sunset officially next year, 2026, but $58 billion spread over 5 years is quite generationally transformative when we compare it, at least in terms of previous federal investment, as you could even see on that chart I showed earlier, in a reduction over time. I mean, we will see a spike in that chart probably for 2021 through 2026. But if we were to zoom in a little closer, you can see how it breaks down in terms of drinking water projects versus clean water. Basically captures wastewater and stormwater together, if you're just kind of wondering what that means, and then kind of other miscellaneous water projects. If you look at the bottom here, you'll see a sharing of primarily it's an EPA. I mean, more than 94% of this funding is coming through EPA. A very small sliver in the Department of Army or Army Corps of Engineers for some projects. But this is all to say that in terms of solutions, I do think more federal funding is a solution. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I do think it has to be part of the solution set here. And I think we're seeing evidence of that. And we will see continued evidence of that as this funding goes out the door, as places are realizing benefits from that funding. We've seen this over many decades, actually. So one I would argue, pretty successful program is the WIFIA program. This is a competitive loan program for water infrastructure projects specifically. Since 2018, I want to say there's been over 140 loans across the country, amounting to over $22 billion. So again, these are not grants, but these are competitive loans that do help many communities better leverage their ability to invest in these systems. So just pointing this out as one particular program that did receive a boost from the bipartisan infrastructure law, and I think still is a pretty increased bipartisan interest in this moving forward. I keep mentioning the state revolving fund programs. I'm going to go into a little more detail about them here. I do think the SRFs are also part of the solution set. My colleagues and I did an analysis a few months ago, just because so much of that $58 billion you just saw goes through the state revolving funds. In other words, it's not just grants that are coming to communities. A lot of that money, whether it's for lead pipe improvements, it's for resilience, it's for green infrastructure, it's all going through, most of it's going through the state revolving funds. And the ways in which the state revolving fund programs are run, as you can imagine, is a little different from state to state. But in general, there is a planning process, there is a project selection process, and then there are capacity concerns and constraints around this. So a state entity, typically a state Department of Environment usually, or a Department of Natural Resources, the title can vary, they go through what they call an intended use plan process. So they develop a plan to identify what these are going to be our priorities for our water infrastructure investment at a state level for these issues. They then define a project priority list across the state, saying, hey, these are our most important projects that should probably receive some level of support from these loans. It's then on the individual systems to actually apply and access that funding, hence kind of the capacity concerns here, right? Like they have the ability to apply and get this money, but that takes time, that takes staff, that takes some level of technical and managerial capacity to do that. And that's where we see some breakdowns in actually some of this money that ultimately comes from the federal level, goes through the states, and ultimately reaches communities. We see a breakdown in how that's actually worked across the country. And so these are a few questions that we asked in our analysis of state revolving fund programs across the country. So I mentioned before this idea of technical assistance, or TA. So we went through all 50 states. There are state revolving fund programs for drinking water and then also for clean water, right? So there's basically 100 programs across the country here with all sorts of planning and project selection processes. But we went through and asked, hey, like, do they, in these intended use plans, do they recognize that there's a need for technical assistance? Do they say, hey, we need to help communities better understand and navigate this funding process? And as you can see on this map, it's like, yeah, like most states recognize there is a need for technical assistance, right? They recognize that communities may not be able to navigate this on their own. And so, you know, I think this is kind of reaffirming. It's a good thing, right? But it breaks down pretty quickly if you're like, hey, does the state, beyond like the SRF, do they have separate funding sources, for example, for green projects, right? That green infrastructure, it totally breaks down, right? You don't see much information on this in either the intended use plan. We did look at other state web pages on this information, so it's not like the intended use plan has every single detail on these programs, but it quickly breaks down when we look at these sorts of issues. Breaks down even in some ways further if you're like, hey, does the intended use plan describe staffing demands within the short and long-term goals? So we know there's these huge workforce challenges, like in thinking about projects and the investment needed for those projects. Is there a recognition that there needs to be workforce development considered here? And we tend to not see that addressed either in many of these plans. So again, wide variety across the country. You know, there is a process, there is funding technically available, but is that funding reaching all places at all times in the most efficient ways? Probably not, and it may not be reaching some of these communities that also need it for workforce and other economic development purposes. I'll end on kind of this point here. I've kind of talked about sort of federal solutions and roles, state roles. I do think that you know, the rubber sort of hits the pavement here with localities and more broadly regions. And so one idea that has really, I think, gained interest across the country is this idea of one water. The idea that our drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater needs are not kind of separate things. It's not like, hey, even though our regulations, we have a Safe Drinking Water Act and a Clean Water Act, you know, those are kind of separate. You know, the reality is this is all an interconnected system, right? And you can just see here a graphic from actually Los Angeles as part of, they have a plan called a One Water Plan actually to set priorities through 2040. But you can see that they are looking at groundwater, drinking water, wastewater, recycled water, rain, stormwater, it's all part of a system, right? And there needs to be more integrated planning, not only just within infrastructure itself, but also connected perhaps to land use concerns, economic development concerns, that this is not just some isolated engineering exercise, right, that we're going through. So, I do see this happening in a range of markets. So this isn't just for large urban markets. We do see smaller communities considering these issues as well. I just think it makes logical sense. I'm a planner by background, so I'm always a fan of more planning, but I do think that we need to get out of this mindset of siloed water infrastructure investment and sort of regulation and compliance. One idea that I've also been testing out quite a bit, and I think Las Vegas is a great example of this, is the idea of regionalization, right? And regionalization in both formal and informal ways. I think there's a lot of natural skepticism on the part of communities, especially small communities, that they think regionalization means consolidation, right? They think, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my system. I'm going to have to partner with my neighbor. And that's not always true. There is a spectrum to regionalization, and there can be a wide variety of actors involved in regional efforts. There can be individual member agencies, as we see here in the Southwater Nevada Authority. And then we can also see it in communities looking at, as you can see on this graphic, in terms of economic development, workforce development, industry partners, contractors, training providers, community-based organizations. They are collecting around a single table to address these issues versus, hey, the water utility is just in isolation doing these things, that they are actually an active partner in these conversations. And sort of an idea that I put out there in other research is the idea that water utilities are anchor institutions in many ways, right? They are not just service providers. Yes, they are, but they also are in many ways potential training hubs for people. They are important to champion environmental efforts in their communities. I think that there's certainly a more visible role in which water utilities can play, not just at a local level, but at a regional scale too. This is just a quick map showing on more of the funding and financing side. Some communities are creating whole new stormwater utilities actually, and creating new stormwater fees to pay for different improvements. You can see it's not as common in out here in the Mountain West per se. You see a little in Utah and Colorado, but it's especially prevalent in Minnesota and the Midwest and Great Lakes region. So in other words, looking at new types of fees and funding sources to cover some of these stormwater needs we're seeing across the country. So an example that, hey, we're not just going to rely on volumetric rates and the existing charges we have, but there are potential other revenue streams that places are considering. In terms of, and I won't go through all of this, but at a local level, how we actually do projects, I think, needs also to be reimagined. And we think of this in particular when it comes to projects connected to our climate needs. So in terms of project procurement, the types of materials that we decide to use for projects, the types of designs we decide to pursue for projects, the types of entities, right, that we work with to do these projects. This is all, I think, should be under consideration, because I think business as usual in this space is not necessarily leading to most resilient projects. And in fact, I think in many places, we tend to just focus on existing gray infrastructure systems, large centralized systems that can be very costly and honestly more brittle in terms of different climate pressures. We probably need more distributed green infrastructure projects, and that's going to require a new outlook on how we actually select and design and finance projects too. Last but not least, I want to be sure to kind of end on this, is in terms of some of the equity ramifications I was describing before. We have seen a move towards customer assistance programs, other financial relief for individual households here. So in as much as we need to keep up with investment, we need to try new projects, we need to throw more money at this stuff, that still doesn't necessarily ultimately address the real pain and challenges we are seeing hit individual households here. And so again, this takes some ingenuity as well. You can see this was, I think, from the city of Buffalo during the pandemic, but some communities are providing debt relief. I mean, households are collecting actually debt because of unpaid water bills. And so some utilities are providing debt forgiveness. They are providing additional flexibility around bills. So I just put that out there as something else to consider more broadly across the sector. And I would not be in true Brookings fashion if I did not show a few reports that you could look at if you're interested in more information here. So the left report here is an analysis I did on water utility finances a few years ago. The middle one is looking more specifically at those water workforce needs I was describing before. And the last report that you see there on the right looks more at water use concerns, which might be especially relevant here in Vegas. So I really appreciate the time tonight and appreciate any questions. Yeah.
Oh, hold on.
Mike.
Gee, that's gonna make me nervous. Okay. So thinking in terms of the solution set you referenced,
Yeah.
and I know that you've mentioned, obviously, there's no real federal funding mechanism, there's no national plan.
Yeah.
But I am curious, has anybody conceptualized a system that would divert the floodwaters to the drought-stricken areas, considering we have to update most of our infrastructure anyway?
Right. Well, we do see, right, through the multi-state sort of issues at play, especially along the Colorado River, we see, you know, kind of those intermediary, I guess I would call them, kind of approaches or options. I have not seen at a national level, I mean, there's just, especially right now, there is just so much uncertainty, period, of will there be funding coming? Like, what even is policy? Like, I mean, there are just huge questions around that. I have not personally seen any like independent, like proactive strategy on that front, but I would imagine certainly being here, being in the Mountain West, like that's probably of more pressing concern for leaders here. That's not to say that it isn't a concern for some leaders at a national level. I just haven't seen that as part of a larger, like integrated plan, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question on the funding. Most of the presentation I've attended regarding water infrastructure is all based on federal funding. Where is the private equity? Where is the Wall Street?
Yeah.
Other utilities like power, gas, and
Yeah.
other utilities are all mostly privately funded. How come there was not much interest from the private financial institution or private sector when it comes to financing of the water infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, I could have probably included a slide on the muni market, actually. I mean, the municipal bond market is actually really important for financing many of these projects. And so the reason that individual systems may, for example, apply for an SRF loan or a WIFIA loan, right, is because those may offer slightly more competitive rates than a municipal bond. But still, the municipal bond market is essential for some of these large capital projects. So there is involvement, for sure, but in terms of, I think what your question is getting at, more of sort of larger scale, systemic sort of private investment, if you will, in water infrastructure, there are investor-owned utilities here. I want to say the split is about 90% publicly owned and operated and about 10% investor-owned and operated. And so there's larger conglomerates like American Water, if you've ever heard of them, that operate systems across a few different markets. But still, it's much smaller in comparison to just the vast array of all those other community water systems I was showing. And there has been appetite. If I probably did this presentation, I don't know, like 5 years ago, I may have had a slide on public-private partnerships. And so there was an appetite, and I think there still is an appetite among some of the private investor community in exploring, hey, is water infrastructure potentially an area in which P3s could have involvement? I think there's, just my own personal opinion, I think there's less appetite there because the revenue streams are more questionable than, for example, like a toll road in transportation. I think there's concerns among certainly many like users and households of like, what does it mean, you know, when a private entity comes in because of the sort of the public purpose and public resource, I think that water is seen as, you know, generally speaking. There are also, I'd say in the climate space, which is an area that I've done a lot of work in too, has been a lot of appetite in looking at water infrastructure in terms of resilience. And so we see this in, you know, climate bonds, green bonds to a certain extent. But still, a lot of this, even in the climate space, ties to like adaptation elements, and financing for adaptation, at least in the private sector, is considered riskier, harder to measure the returns of that versus like mitigation and sort of clean energy type projects. So it's evolving, I think, is maybe the way to think about it. But I think there's a lot of historical and other structural reasons why, in terms of regulation and otherwise, that we tend to still see the primary emphasis on public funding. Yeah.
So follow-up question.
Okay.
Follow-up question. Is there any talk on privatizing any of these local utilities anywhere?
I haven't been following that, to be honest with you. I mean, there on the P3 front, I know there were a couple examples from a few years ago. I think Bayonne, New Jersey was one. There were some systems that were consolidated in Pennsylvania as part of a public-private partnership. For what it's worth, the Trump administration, during their first round in 2017, I spoke with some of their leaders before the bipartisan infrastructure law. They actually wanted to do a national infrastructure plan that was mostly driven by public-private partnerships. And so I imagine as part of that, they were envisioning perhaps, I would say like privatization per se, but they were looking for a greater role of the private sector in this space, but that didn't come to fruition. So I just haven't seen, the widespread, I guess, privatization or private investment in this space per se. That's not to say it couldn't happen, but I just don't see it in the short term.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah.
So the slide that I thought most stunning was 55% of the system serving 2% of the population.
Yes.
That just is unsustainable. So what happens in those communities when they can't sustain it themselves?
This is the question that's hitting a lot of places right now. And maybe some people in the room, I probably already told this story too, but I was I've done some work in Kentucky and Appalachia, and in those types of communities, you're seeing, first of all, just very small systems. You're seeing population loss. You're seeing economic decline. And when you see economic decline and population loss, what that means is less revenue going into those systems because there's a lower or smaller customer base for those systems. And so, meanwhile, the workforce issues in those places can be severe because if you have a staff, even if it's a small utility, you have a staff of 5 people and you're losing 2 of them, then you've lost 40% of your workforce as well. And so there's kind of like double or triple whammies happening in some of these places. And it's not a question of if the system will fail, it's more a question of when, right? And the state leaders in particular, the public service commissions and other departments of environment, they know kind of where these systems are, and you can kind of read the headlines on kind of where the next sort of failure could happen. I think there have been a couple, I want to say in Kentucky and West Virginia potentially. I don't mean to stress Appalachia, but I think this is kind of becoming like the bullseye for this. And I think they're dealing with difficult questions and decisions around, quite honestly, a lot of these smaller communities are, not just with water infrastructure, but just more broadly of, if you don't have water infrastructure, you can't even have a community, quite honestly. And it leads to tension for some of the leaders of these systems. As I said before, probably like regionalization or consolidation probably in some form needs to happen, but you start to run into issues of, it's a point of community pride for them. They don't want to give it up because it is quite literally the last asset they may have in that community. And so whose role is it then to kind of feed the tough medicine of what do you need to do? And the state, I will say, has kind of stepped in some cases to provide extra relief. So even if the federal government is only providing loans, sometimes the state will come in and provide additional support or some sort of capacity in those cases. But that's obviously a case-by-case basis, and that's probably not a durable solution.
Consolidation would make sense, but that assumes that they share the same space. So if they're remote, that creates a whole nother challenge.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, this is part of the reason I am personally very interested in these regionalization ideas because I like to think that it isn't like a binary black-white, like you must consolidate or you don't. Like, is there a way in which the systems can partner with other actors in their region or their broader region where they feel like they can still have the ownership of the system without like consolidation? Like, I don't know what that looks like, but these are big research questions, to say nothing of policy questions that a lot of places are facing. And I wish there were a clearer answer to that, but there really isn't.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joe. Just given the fact that at this very moment we're in a government shutdown,
Yeah.
do you have any sense of whether EPA or other federal water players are more vulnerable to not being able to perform should an emergency come up? Are these kind of agencies targeted for employee cuts themselves, and how does that trickle
Yeah.
down?
Well, I mean, there's concerns that first and foremost of just the reductions in force and the reality that there's just fewer staff, regardless of shutdown, that we're kind of, at the control panel around these issues. So that was a primary concern to me in terms of like technical assistance and like who's even the point of contact for some of these places. They can't even access certain like web portals, pages have been shut down or just broken and there's no one there to fix it, right? So it's then like, where does a place go? And I mean, I think and I'll get a positive maybe out of this in a second, so it's not all doom and gloom. But like you also have FEMA too, which I haven't really named. FEMA also has been very much, I don't know what verb to use here, has been called into question, where FEMA is very important for I would argue many water-related investments in terms of resilience, and to say nothing of proactive investment, but repairs if there were like a disaster or something. Not to say that the National Flood Insurance Program is perfect, it isn't, but like has had problems for a while. But I also would worry with FEMA in this case, in addition to EPA. So it's not just EPA; it's also some other agencies where I have seen, maybe to put a slight positive on this, where I have seen some, I would say, urgency or momentum is on the part of some of the water associations. So there are the Water Environment Federation, the American Water Works Association, there's a whole other set of them. They are trying to fill some of this gap, at least in terms of technical assistance, not obviously in terms of funding, but they are providing a voice and some sort of community and peer-to-peer learning and exchange and some type of capacity building for these systems, not a substitute at all for the federal kind of vacuum, if you will. I mean, there have even been conversations among philanthropy and, other sort of third-party actors here too. It's a concern. And I mean, I would be nervous, certainly during a time of a shutdown, what that means for these issues.
Since the hour is drawing near, I'll just officially draw things to a close. And thank you all for your kind attention and participation. Great questions. And this happens to be our final scholar lecture of the fall semester, but do be paying attention to your email accounts and your social media accounts. We'll be announcing a spring slate of lectures and events, and we hope to see you at those. So thanks again for coming out.